Clarence Thomas, for instance, is very strongly, he believes, all black schools, even if it's just de facto segregation, is not a problem because, what's the problem with having all one school, all one race in a school? It's a sense of community, it's a sense of culture. There's nothing wrong with that. So that's a valid viewpoint. For people who think it is a problem, though, could you think of any ways that you could have any affirmative action integration program that doesn't discriminate, even against whites? Can anyone think of different methods to do that? Henry, could you come up with something like that? This is a trickier question.
Well, in the case of affirmative action programs, maybe we could have something involving minority students, some type of outreach program to introduce them to separate different cultures and take on new experiences that they aren't familiar with.
That's excellent. So nothing really forcible, nothing really giving them a boost, but more of just a recruitment effort. And it's exactly a really great response. Anybody else? Robert, yeah?
I think if you have different class levels, in high school it's like that, but in middle school it's not. I think you got classes split up on smartness.
Mm-hmm.
I think that will make students want to achieve more, mix in different races and cultures.
Okay, so give also incentives, right, to bring people into those higher level classes while not necessarily discriminating on them. Any final comments? People want to get something in? PT?
There should be a way where colleges, they have to have a certain number of people from races. That might be an ideal.
So you would require them to have different numbers of racial groups?
You can't require them, but actually you would have to require them. So maybe have a certain number of black people, a certain number of Latino people, a certain number of European people.
That sounds like an interesting idea that I'm not sure would fly with the Supreme Court, but we'll get into that a little later. So, summing up these two viewpoints, this is one pretty crude way of summarizing one idea, which is that a lot of people, especially on the right, think that, okay, Brown happened, slavery's over, all races are now equal, so why should race even matter anymore, right? And if it matters at all it's doing is giving minorities unfair advantages over whites, over traditionally advantaged classes. And so this is a really crude, sort of snarky remark about, this is the race card and you can cash it into your advantage and you can get out of a sticky situation. This is a pretty accurate representation of what a lot of people, I think, on the right feel today, is that all race is doing is unfairly helping out minorities, and it doesn't really equal the playing field. It's another kind of discrimination. This is the other side of the argument. And people think, I would say on the left, that since you had, decades, even centuries of racial discrimination, you have to sort of try to equal the playing field. And this is a comic that illustrates, I think, how a lot of white people view themselves and not quite realize how they're being taken advantage. So this is about Bob and Bob's story. How Bob's great-grandparents got into the USA, the politicians saying, we need to let the right people into our country. And of course, by right, he's saying, European people, people that we like because they're of our race. Can anyone look over this and try to figure out what's going on in that panel? This is actually a pretty common occurrence.
Is that an Asian man marrying a white guy?
No, not quite. It's more of an artistic. What do you think, Robert?
They let the white people get the loan for the houses, I guess,
Mm-hmm.
and the black people just said, "Sorry, we can't help you."
Yeah. What effect do you think that would have? If a black family couldn't get a home loan, they couldn't move into a certain neighborhood. They couldn't buy a house of a certain price, right? Almost everybody buys a loan if they need a house, and this was an extremely common practice in the 50s and the 60s. Banks, not by law, but just by practice, would simply not lend to black families. They wouldn't allow them to get a loan if they were asking to move into a white neighborhood or even to a nicer neighborhood, simply because they were discriminatory, they didn't want to offend their white clients. This was very big, very huge practice. And of course, the white family gets approved here. How Bob's dad begins his career, he gets the job, but the African-American man is, kept out because he's not like us. How Bob's parents become homeowners, similar kinds of things. The woman selling the house shows them the house while she might not show it to a black family. Here's Bob as a youth. He's caught with drugs, but of course the cop lets him off with a warning, and this mean cop over here is arresting a black girl and is arresting her. And this is also obviously a fact of life. The cops have a lot of discretion. I'm actually just reading about this in criminal procedure. They have a lot of discretion just deciding if they want to charge you. They don't have to charge you with any crime, but they can just kind of decide. And there's a lot of evidence that it's racially discriminatory. And then here's Bob finally saying, I've never benefited from racism. All these minorities are getting advantages over me. I've never benefited. And of course, this comic is like his entire family history is one advantage over minorities after another. So those are the two sides of the equation. You've got, race is just an advantage, it's just a card you can cash in, versus, in reality, African Americans have been so disadvantaged that we have to do something to try to equal the playing field. So we had our little discussion. Today we're going to be talking about diversity in the school setting after Brown, especially in higher education. We're going to be talking about whether affirmative action is really a kind of discrimination, and then we're going to get into the cases, and then finally a game, and then we'll set you up in some group activities. So, to step back for a second, remember the court was really opposed to de jure segregation. What was the difference between de jure and de facto? It is...
De facto was a law. You can't be segregated by law. It's the other way around.
Other way around.
De jure was you can be separated by law. De facto was segregation okay as long as there is no law against it.
Exactly. Yeah. Just remember facto, fact, right? De jure is law. De facto is just by fact. There's no legal authority. And so this is an interesting comic. It's showing the Supreme Court decision hammering off the shackles of segregated schools. And what we see here. At all levels, the Supreme Court said you have to integrate your school districts by law. Now, what did this mean in practice? It meant that white school districts had to be dismantled. You couldn't have white school districts and black school districts. You had to provide parents choice of where they sent their kids to school, but this wasn't enough in a lot of cases. And why? Because of de facto segregation. Because in the North and South, you had these centuries of discrimination preventing black families from living where white families were, and people sometimes just wanted to live around people like them. But just saying that, you can choose what school you want to go to, that wasn't necessarily enough because, why would a black family want to send their kids, 50 miles away to the white school district? Why would the white family want to do the same thing? Why would they want to be sent so far from home into a community that might be hostile to them, right, that they're not familiar with? So you had to take really strong action to try to integrate these schools forcibly. So this meant the Supreme Court gave authority to lower federal courts. Remember, what's the lowest kind of federal court? We got the Supreme Court, circuit courts. What's the lowest kind of? What do you think, Robert? District courts, right? District courts were given so much authority they could come up with plans to integrate public schools, and this often meant the forced busing of public school kids. And this is a picture. Where do you think this is a picture from? I want to just get some guesses on this. What do you think, Montreal? If you had to guess where this picture is from. Mississippi. What do you think, Nicole? Just give me a guess. No idea? Alabama, Mississippi. Good guesses. This is Boston. Sorry for us. I'll call on you next time. This is Boston, right? So it was controversial everywhere. Boston is and was incredibly segregated by race. And the courts in Boston drew up an integration plan, and they had to bus. This is an all-black sort of school district being bused into a white school district, surrounded by riot police, surrounded by a police escort, and because it caused riots, it was so controversial. So people were not a fan of the Supreme Court. They were not fans of the district courts because they were basically, changing the landscape that had been in place for a long time. So what you have now is a public backlash to this kind of integrating model. And you have the end of all lawful segregation. So the court starts to shift, and I think this is a really interesting moment. In sort of the mid-70s, the court starts to shift and begins to say, all right, if you did not have de jure segregation in a district, there's really no authority for us or for any other court to integrate your district. If you just have segregation by fact, right, and there's no history of lawful segregation, there's no reason to integrate the school district. And this is a big line in the sand. All of a sudden we're saying integration is swell, but it's not all that swell. And this is a map of Detroit. This is actually a census map of today. The red dots are whites, and the blue dots are blacks, the yellow dots are Hispanics. And this just shows how segregated Detroit is. You can really see just the city boundaries right here. And this was in the case of Milliken. The Detroit Federal Court District wanted to integrate, from these white suburbs into the city and vice versa. And the court really said, you cannot do that. There's no history of segregation in all of these districts. So that was the line that was drawn in the sand. And so then we get to the question of today. What about universities? What if they wanted to admit minorities? And so here we have some lovely pictures. After Brown, right, universities, just like any other public school, have to admit minorities. But they're not big fans. Some of them anyway. So we have the University of Mississippi here. Anybody know who that guy is? The first African-American admitted to the University of Mississippi? No? James Meredith. It was a huge controversial issue. This is 1962. This is even, just pretty much very close after Brown. It was extremely controversial. And then even today you have a number of, bigoted white jerks who are obviously still not fans of, minorities being admitted to their schools. This is Auburn University, Oklahoma State University. So you can see there's a lot of hostility to minority students. So what we have here are schools that are trying to remedy what they've been doing in the past, trying to balance out the discrimination they've been doing in the past with sort of their current practices. Can someone read this first panel for me? What do you think, Henry?
I can't see that.
No, we can't see that. Leo, can you see that?
Some campuses actively sought to increase minority representation in the student body.
Okay, Terrence?
However, years of discrimination and exclusion have led many minorities to be less academically competitive than they would have been otherwise.
Carly, can you read it?
Thus, these campuses instituted policies by which minorities stood a better chance of admission.
And someone read the quote from the NAACP, DT?
Systematic exclusion requires
Systemic.
inclusion. Affirmative action is just
One tool.
that
I'll do it for you.
ensures
That-
women
yeah, good.
and minorities have opportunities to be
Included. Gotta get some glasses, buddy. All right, so this is really showing the reasoning for affirmative action. You had a desire on the part of the schools, maybe just to have a diverse campus for diversity's sake, maybe to remedy past discrimination, but you have this problem, and so you had to have these policies that minorities had a little boost in the admissions process. And here are the two big viewpoints on this. On one side, you've got this comic where, the white student is saying, oh, those SAT questions were so brutal, and the black student is saying, well, I just checked off my ethnicity, so I know I aced the test. This is a really kind of snarky way of saying, gosh, all you have to do if you're black or any other minority is just check off that you are that minority and you're going to get into college. That's obviously wrong from the perspective here. And here's the other side. You have all these different applicants to colleges. You have the daughter of an alumni, the son of a big donor, a soccer player, someone from a state far away, and then a minority. And all these different people, what do they have in common if they're applying to a college? Anyone have any idea? They all have one big thing in common.
Education.
They don't necessarily, a soccer player may not have a college education. No, they're not all the same skin color.
They have connections.
They have connections. They have a boost, right? Every single one of these people, because of who they are, has some advantage over Joe Schmo in applying to the
it's
school.
called like a soft something, right?
It's a soft factor, exactly. And then here's this guy who didn't get in, and he only points to the minority and says, it's your fault I didn't get in. Not that it's the alumni, the donor's son, the soccer player, who also get the same kind of boost. And so this is kind of saying it's ridiculous to only blame one category of these soft factors, as DT said, for me not getting in. These are the two real perspectives on affirmative action. But nevertheless, this guy who doesn't get in, or girl, starts filing lawsuits and saying, this is not fair under the 14th Amendment, that I am not allowed into these schools and other people are. And you have Bakke, which is the first big case. This is the first huge battle over affirmative action. Here is Bakke, who looks kind of creepy, actually. And this is a picture of the court the day of the oral argument. People knew what a huge deal this was. People knew that this could affect almost every program under the sun. So they were lining up to go hear it. And this is actually some protests. This was in Michigan, I believe. And the woman is saying, if Bakke wins, we all lose, and all these different areas. If people thought, if affirmative action can't happen, then there's never a way for the federal government or state government to have any kind of program that gives advantages to minorities in business, in housing, in employment, in any sort of field. So this was a huge problem that people saw a lot at risk for. So then Bakke is handed down. And what was the test that they used? You guys talked about it yesterday, I heard. What was the test the court used? How did you analyze this affirmative action? Was it rational basis, intermediate? Yes, Carly?
Strict scrutiny.
It was strict scrutiny, excellent. And what are the two prongs of strict scrutiny. What does the state have to show for someone to actually pass strict scrutiny? It's really hard. Remember, Terrence? No? Montreal? If it's race, right, it's subject to strict scrutiny, but then what do you have? What is the test of strict scrutiny, Robert?
Merely tailored.
And what kind of an interest does it have to be? Just like a nice interest?
Yeah, Hammer said it.
Huh?
Hammer Carly said it.
What'd you say?
Compelling.
Compelling, absolutely. Which is like a very, very strong interest. It has to be narrowly tailored, and it has to be a compelling interest. Good job. And what do they say beyond this? All right, number one, this is important because this will be on your quiz. Right? They say these. Okay, one, it's subject to strict scrutiny. Two, they go on to say, all right, even if you have this sort of idea that we have an interest, are your interests actually compelling? And the school says, number one, we want to remedy social discrimination. Minorities are always discriminated against, and that's a bad thing. Court says, no, you can't do it. It's too general, it's too vague. We're not going to accept that as a compelling interest. If that was your interest, it would fail. But they say, oh, if what you want is a diverse student body, just like I was hearing in the warm-up discussion, there are real benefits to that. And the court says that is a compelling interest. So it depends on how you're justifying your program, whether or not we're going to uphold it or not. And then finally they say, if you're going to set aside specific seats, if you say, like DT was saying, if we say 10 seats for blacks, 10 seats for Latinos, 20 seats for whites, etc., that is unconstitutional. Remember what was the name that they called this? They gave this a very sort of specific name, and they said, these are never acceptable. It starts with a Q.
Oh, like votes, quotas.
Quotas, right? A fixed racial quota is never all right. And then, sadly, this last bit gets cut off. Yeah, you can't see it. What was the name of the school plan that Justice Powell said might be okay? It was a big Ivy League school, and they were using a kind of plan. Justice Powell just said, you know what, if you adopted this school's plan, then maybe it would be fine. Anyone remember? This will be on the quiz as well.
The Yale plan?
No, sadly, it wasn't the Yale plan.
The dark mouth one.
Yale's big rival plan. Anyone?
Harvard.
The Harvard plan. What was in the Harvard plan? Anyone remember what was in that plan? Amber, you can't remember? Did they give out strict quotas? No, they had pluses. If you applied to Harvard and you were a minority, they would give you this sort of amorphous plus. Like, yay, this is a nice thing for you. Maybe it'll help you in your review. But it's not 10 points, it's not a set seat. It was this sort of fluffy plus factor. And Justice Powell said, all right, that's nice, holistic, individual assessment. We'll approve that potentially. So Bakke comes down. This very kind of weird opinion. It's all over the map. Some kinds of affirmative action are good, some are not good. And then the court is quiet. There's absolutely no noise. They don't touch affirmative action with a 10-foot stick. And the court basically hides in a bag and says, we do not want to deal with this issue because everyone has a different opinion and there's no really easy answer. So they hide. But conservatives are really not cool with this, right? They think that this is an unfair, racially discriminatory policy, even what Bakke very limitedly endorsed. And so they start coming up with test cases, like the NAACP had actually done, to find plaintiffs who are sympathetic and nice, and they bring them to the Supreme Court to try to overturn these little policies. And so you have these two women that become famous in 2003 when their cases are brought to the Supreme Court. You got Jennifer Gratz, who was denied admission to the undergrad program at UMichigan, and Barbara Grutter, who applied to be a law student. Both of them file suit under the 14th Amendment and say, this is not fair. The affirmative action programs of these schools need to be overturned. And you had protests. People were pretty... I can still remember. I was at my house, and I remember when the case was handed down. This was the big second battle, whether affirmative action would be upheld or not. And this is a great picture. This is the same photograph, and this guy's saying affirmative action is racism in action, and up here they're saying defend affirmative action at the Supreme Court. So there's people on both sides in very close proximity. I think this was also at Michigan, which is really the center of the controversy. So why did the court hold differently in these two cases? They're very, very similar. Can anyone give me, how were these cases similar, either on the facts or on the reasoning? How are these cases similar?
They gave points or something, right? Like if you're black, it gave you a lot. Like I think instead of 100, you got 20.
In both cases, they gave you
No,
points.
in one of them, I don't know which one. But
All right. Well, I'm asking what is similar. That's a good reason why it's different. But how are these similar? They both concerned what kind of education, Terrence? Hmm. What kind of education did this concern? Was it lower? Was it public school education? Was it grade school education, like Brown?
It was college.
It was college. It was higher education. Excellent. All right, so you have a lot of similarities. Both of these were higher education cases. It was a college and a law school. All right. In the admissions process, you had all these different factors. Race was one factor. If you were an athlete, if you were a great writer, there were all these different factors. Both the schools, all they wanted was diversity in the student body. Leah, under Bakke, is diversity an acceptable goal? Absolutely. So that seems fine. And they saw all different kinds of diversity, right? It wasn't just race. So it seems like if the court's going to rule on both these cases on the same day, like they did, it would come out the same. But there were differences. One difference, as DT already pointed out, was you had a point system versus this plus system. So I think we can already see where the court's going to head with that. One was a law school, and one was an undergrad program. And that might not seem really important, but Justice O'Connor kind of makes a big deal in the Grutter case as to why this big law school is very important. One case, Justice Rehnquist says, the points you get are outcome determinative. Anyone have a clue what that means? If it's outcome determinative or not?
It depends.
What depends?
Like the facts, but it depends on what the judges decide as many points you get.
Okay, so yeah, if you're black, you get 20 points. I think in addition what he's meaning is that makes the sole difference as to whether you get in or not. Whether you get those 20 points determines the outcome. All right, this is a key term to remember from this case. Outcome determinative. It will be on your quiz. To quote Mr. Riley, it will be on your quiz. And then something else I want to point out that I found pretty interesting about Grutter are these outside briefs that they submit to the court. And the business and military community gives these briefs in support of affirmative action policies. And I want to think about why that might be, but we'll come back to that in a minute. So Gratz, could someone read the first bullet point of Gratz, if you can read it?
Acceptable forms of increasing diversity through admissions must include individualized consideration.
All right, Robert, thank you. What do you think individualized consideration means? Can you follow up on that for me? It's a very nice term, but what does it mean?
Like, it depends on the person.
Yeah.
It's like person or race, I guess. And that depends it depends on the outcome.
Okay, yeah, pretty much what Rehnquist is saying is right now you have this point system which determines the outcome of whether or not you get in based on your race. And he's saying, no, that's not cool. What you need is a program that considers the whole individual, right? This sort of holistic program where you're going to evaluate all the different parts of this person's application, not just their race and not just where they come from, but all these different factors. Second bullet point, Henry.
Sorry.
It's okay.
The fact that this been
Oh no, here, we're here.
Oh. I can't see everything.
That's an X, sorry.
Oh.
The first X.
Automatic distribution of points has the effect of making the factor race decisive. A system that employs such a distribution is thus unconstitutional.
Thank you. Just like Robert said, this determines the outcome, so it's not cool, and this got cut off very sadly. Sorry, Mr. Riley warned me about this, but I couldn't fix it in time. The fact that the implementation of a program capable of providing individualized consideration might present administrative challenges does not render constitutional an otherwise problematic system. Does anyone have a clue what that quote means? The fact that the implementation of a program might present some challenges doesn't make constitutional an otherwise problematic system. What do you think, DT?
So if you just look at the guy just for what he does, then that still doesn't mean it's constitutional.
I think Ray was saying as long as you look at the guy in all of his guyness, then that's fine.
Oh, okay.
What he's saying here, I think, what the undergrad school was saying is we are the University of Michigan. We are an enormous state school. We get thousands and thousands and thousands of applications every single year. There is no way we can look at the applications and think, oh, DT's such this cool guy, I'm going to read over his essays 3 times, and I'm going to think, what are the real qualities that make DT DT? And I'm going to give him this holistic assessment with these weird plus factors that aren't points. They're saying, we have 10,000 applications a year. This is impossible for us. And Rehnquist says, too bad. That just because it might be hard for you, it doesn't make any other system constitutional, simply because it's going to be too costly. Then, Rudder. All right, if you want to remember a way, just try to think of a way to differentiate these 2 cases. Gratz, very negative. Gratz is very negative towards affirmative action, saying these are all the different ways that it's not going to happen. Rudder is actually saying, here are the ways that it could happen. Rudder is the positive case. Those are the 2 ways you might remember it for your quiz. All right, so what are some acceptable forms of diversity? Carly?
Acceptable forms of increasing diversity include securing a critical mass of minority students, not the same as setting aside students or racial balancing.
Okay, read one more for me.
Race or ethnicity can be used flexibly as a plus factor, not the same as separable admissions track.
Okay, keep going for me, Montrell.
Minimum goals which are flexible, not the same as a quota, tracking racial outcomes over the course of admission season, individualized,
Holistic review.
Holistic review, not predetermined based on these.
Excellent. Holistic is a weird word indeed. It basically just means a review of all the different attributes of a candidate. So Justice O'Connor goes through and really lays out all these things which are cool. The court is saying if you want to get a critical mass of students, whatever that means, that is a weird term, but like a set number, not really a quota per se, but if you're looking for a broad range where at minimum you're looking for a number of students, that's fine, even if it's not really fixed. You can have these plus factors, which you remember from Bakke. You can have these flexible goals. Again, it's not a quota. You can track your racial outcomes. You can say, okay, we have this many Native Americans, this many Asians in our class. You can track that. And you can have holistic review, as long as it's not predetermined, as long as you're not doing what Justice Rehnquist said and determining the outcome. These are all the things that Grutter says, well done.
Were they doing shady stuff though? Like I think in somewhere in the book, say there were 12 black people who had really good grades and everything, and then there were similar Latino people. So out of the 12 black people, like 11 were accepted, and out of the 12 Latino people, only like 2.
I like it. You're reading behind sort of the legal jargon, right? You read Justice Rehnquist's dissent, right?
Yeah.
Justice Rehnquist in his dissent, yeah, that's exactly what he talks about. He says,
oh.
yeah, no, he's saying, okay, Justice O'Connor, this all sounds really swell, critical mass sounds great, holistic review, and then he's saying, but in reality, what is the school doing, right? He's saying they were really looking for a quota. They were really looking for X number of black students, and they were going to admit them even if they fell below a certain grade range. They were really looking for a certain number of Hispanic students, right? So he's saying you can have all these fluffy terms, but in reality, that was a quota. And people can debate one way or another what a quota is, but that's a really good argument to put forward here.
Well, like a lot of people say that affirmative action only racist against white people and minorities, but like I guess here they're picking a minority and discriminating them against other minorities.
That's an excellent why are they discriminating against other minorities?
I don't know.
Well, you were just saying it. Right. Why?
Maybe a lot of reasons, right?
Right, because they have all these different groups of minorities, not just white versus black or white versus Asian. They're saying, you know, we need X number of this student, X number of this. So they're really just saying, here are the qualifications you need to get in if you are of X race. And that could be a problem. Robert?
Would it be a quota if they have like a certain amount of different race teachers, and they use the teachers to determine the students?
If they were saying we need the student body to match up proportionally with the teachers,
Mm-hmm.
what do you think?
But like by race, like
Yeah.
say you got like it was 10 to 1.
Right.
So you got 10 black students for every one black teacher. Then you got 10 white students for every white teacher.
Mm-hmm.
Would that be a quota still?
Do you think it would?
No, I don't see nothing wrong with it.
I mean, the question isn't whether there's anything wrong with it, right? I mean, the court said quota's bad, right? Critical mass good. It said, you know, minimum goals that are flexible good.
What's
So
the difference though?
Right. What is the difference? I would say the only thing that comes to my mind is that quotas are very fixed. The quota is where a school says we want, you know, 25 black students. Like in Bakke, it said we're holding 16 seats for minorities and for other people. Right? That's the quota. And as long as you're a little bit more flexible, I think the court would say, all right, that's not really a quota. But you can argue both ways, and I think you are both doing really well. And this is the final thing I want to bring up. and this wasn't in your reading, but I just wanted to note, in Grutter, one of the big issues, and this is very rare, a lot of outside groups submitted briefs. They submitted arguments in favor of one side over the other. And the business community and then the military community came out actually in favor of affirmative action. Someone read the business quote. This is right out of the Justice O'Connor opinion. And Supreme Court justices rarely quote from these friend of the court briefs. They're rarely going to say, oh, you know, Nick had an interest in this case, and he wrote me this brief, so I'm going to quote this brief and say why it supports my argument. People rarely do that because who cares what some random third party thinks? Leah, can you read the first quote for me?
Major American businesses have made clear that the skills needed in today's increasingly global marketplace can only be developed through exposure to widely diverse people, cultures, ideas, and viewpoints.
Okay, and this is the business point. And then right down here, Justice O'Connor quotes directly from the military's brief, and she says, the military cannot achieve an officer corps that is both highly qualified and racially diverse unless the service academies and the ROTC use limited race-conscious recruiting and admissions policies. To fulfill the mission, the military must be selective in admissions for training and education for the officer, and then she says, and it must train and educate a highly qualified, racially diverse officer corps in a racially diverse setting. So she's saying, basically, the fact that we need diversity in the business world and in the military world means that in higher education we have to be able to do the same thing, or else you're going to deny American businesses, you're going to deny the American military the ability to have these sort of diverse groups of leaders. Okay, this was really influential, and it was kind of interesting that they weighed in how they did. All right, now on to the game. This is called What Would Fly. You guys know kind of the policies the court gave the thumbs up to. You know the policies the court gave thumbs down to. We're going to look at two different admissions policies, and I want you to raise your hands and tell me what you think would actually fly under the court. All right, can someone read the first one? Yes, Nicole.
In a medical school class that accepts 300 students, no places are held for racial and ethnic minorities.
Okay, and the second question, DT?
In a law school class that accepts 600 students, 50 places are held for racial and ethnic minorities.
This is pretty easy. Montreal, which one would fly? The first one. Why would the first one fly? There's no what? What's the term for this? If you're not holding specific numbers of seats, you're not holding a... Yes, excellent. So the first one would fly, right, like a duck, and quotas will not fly, because we all know the court hates quotas from Bakke. Second one, Amber.
In an undergraduate's admission system that utilizes a point system, racial and ethnic minorities receive 1 extra point.
Good. And Terrence?
In a scholarship application process, racial and ethnic minorities receive an unspecific plus.
Excellent. And Carly, which one would fly?
Second one.
The second one. From what case do you get that reasoning?
The second.
I don't know.
They're also similar.
Oh, DT. I don't
I was
remember.
gonna say neither one of them would.
Yeah.
Neither one of them?
So
Why do you
much
think?
about
Hold on. Montreal, why would neither one fly under your...
Because they both give the similarity is they both give or plus.
Mm-hmm. They both give an advantage. All right. But does the court said that every time you give an advantage to a minority, that means it's off? Henry, remember this?
Sort of.
Yeah?
I think it's Gratz case.
Okay, the Gratz case says points are bad. You cannot give a specific advantage to a minority student. But we know from what case that pluses are all right, Robert?
Grutter.
In Grutter and in even Bakke, right? Both of those cases say if you have a plus, then it's going to fly, like a plane.
But isn't that the same thing?
Isn't it the same thing? Really good question, right? A lot of people have critiqued the court and say all you're doing here is basically asking schools to hide the ball. You're going to say, all right, you want to give out these like sort of quantitative formulas, we're not going to say that's fine, but we are going to say that this amorphous plus is fine. And I think the reason the court has said that, if there is any sort of rhyme or reason to it, is that line, outcome determinative. If you give people a set number of points for being of a certain race, you can really easily see how that in and of itself determines whether or not you get into the school or not. But if you have this sort of holistic, individualized plus system, you can't really say, at least not easily, that that plus is what got you into the school or not. So the court's trying to find this line of, what is determinative and what is not. Leah, first question.
If a white applicant has a higher GPA than a minority applicant, the white applicant gains admission. If two have equal GPAs, the minority applicant gains admission.
Okay, DT.
Race is not a factor at all in admissions.
Okay, Nicole, what do you think would fly?
The second one,
The second one. This is pretty easy. Why would the second one fly?
because they're not discriminating.
Not discriminating at all, right? Would the first one fly, though?
Depends, right?
Why would it depend,
On
DT?
other things, because it's more than GPA. There might be other things in GPA.
Okay, so there might be...
It doesn't make sense to me.
Montreal, what do you think doesn't make sense?
Because it's saying if the white applicant has a higher GPA, then it goes on to say if they both have the equal GPAs.
I get it. I don't like it.
What do you think? If a white applicant has a higher GPA than a minority applicant, the white applicant gets in. If the two have equal GPAs, the minority gains admission. Let's see. We have a penguin.
Penguins don't fly.
Penguins do not fly, which means that this system will not fly. Okay? Because, as Leah said, this is outcome determinative. At the point that you say, we have two equal things, and race is what puts you over the top, right? This is a very clear system of race putting you over the top. Then, you are a penguin, and you cannot fly. All right. Almost towards the end here. First question. As candidates are admitted, the racial makeup of the class is constantly tracked and reported to admissions officers. The second one, Robert?
Certain seats in the admissions class are protected, keeping them open, but not guaranteeing them to racial minorities that might apply later in the process.
Robert, what do you think? Would either fly? Would both fly? Let's just look at the first one. They're just tracking the racial data. Is that okay under the court?
Yeah.
I think it's the first one.
Okay, so you think that what case told us this is actually okay? Rudder. Justice O'Connor says if you want to track, right, the racial makeup of your class, how you're admitting students, that's fine. You're not really doing anything except for just watching it. But the second one, can you protect? What do you think? Can you protect a seat? Even though you're not saying it's only for, minority X? What do you think, DT?
Yeah, because it's a mass thing, right? Something mass. It's different from quota. It's not specific, so yeah.
Excellent. Yeah. I think there's an argument for DT's point that on this case you could say, all right, well, it sounds like a quota. This is, Dwight Howard is fine.
It wasn't even a dunk. He threw it in.
It wasn't a dunk?
It wasn't a dunk. He just threw it in. So
it was a long time ago. I couldn't remember. Well, on this side, DT has a good point, which is it may sound like a quota, but the court might see, all right, it's not quite a quota, but in the end, the court would probably say the fact that you are numerically saying 15 seats, right, it's probably a little too much like a quota, so it probably won't fly. Terrence, first question?
Minority students are preferred over white students, although both have similar test scores.
Okay, Amber?
White students are preferred over minority students, although both have similar test scores.
All right. Preference, what do you think? Can you preference, just broadly, preference? What do you think, Henry? You don't think so, Nicole? Okay. Neither would fly. Excellent job. All right. You cannot, it doesn't matter whether you're favoring whites over blacks or blacks over whites. It doesn't matter if you're minorities over majorities. Neither is going to fly. Like this really fat bird. Okay.
What is that?
I'm not sure. So, we're going to go to our group work now.